They told me my son died on our front lawn. But when I got there, 10 minutes later, he was still warm. His little wheelchair was tipped over in the grass, one wheel spinning slow, creaking like it didn't know it was supposed to stop. The paramedics stood frozen, waiting for clearance from the HOA rep who blocked the driveway with her car. Her name was Marjorie Lang, though everyone in the neighborhood called her Karen behind her back. I called her something worse that day. She stood there with her clipboard, her pastel sweater, her perfect hair, telling the EMTs they weren't authorized to park on the common property. I remember her voice clearer than my own heartbeat. "Rules are rules," she said. My boy, Ethan, couldn't breathe. He'd been born with muscular dystrophy, needed his oxygen hooked up at all times. I wasn't home. I was on base just back from a 6-month deployment. And all I could think was this: I've fought men with rifles. I've dragged brothers through fire. But I never thought evil would look like a woman in pearls holding a clipboard. Before that day, we were just another quiet family in a cul-de-sac that smelled like lawn fertilizer and fresh paint. My name's Daniel Reeves, Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer, retired after 22 years. My wife, Sarah, and our son, Ethan, moved into Maple Grove Estates 3 summers ago, a safe, family-friendly community, the real estate ad promised. The first week we moved in, the neighbors came over with pies and smiles. Marjorie Lang was the first one through the door, HOA president, pearl earrings, clipboard in hand. "We keep things tidy here," she'd said, eyes flicking over the wheelchair ramp I'd built out front. "But don't worry, I'm sure we can make exceptions for special cases." I'd smiled back, not catching the knife in her tone yet. Ethan loved the house. There was a maple tree in the yard with low branches, perfect for hanging the wind chime his mom made from old seashells. On good days, when his lungs were strong, he'd race the neighbor's dog up and down the ramp in his chair, laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac like pure sunlight. Sarah taught art at the elementary school. I spent my days fixing up the garage, turning it into a home gym. It wasn't fancy, but it was peace. For a while, I believed we'd finally outrun the chaos that followed me home from deployments, the noise, the adrenaline, the loss. We built routines: Saturday pancakes, Sunday drives, evenings with the smell of jasmine from the backyard and the hum of Ethan's oxygen machine from his room. But peace doesn't last long in neighborhoods run by people like Marjorie. The first letter came in an envelope stamped Maple Grove HOA. Notice of violation. Issue: unauthorized modification to exterior property. Translation: my wheelchair ramp. Sarah tried to reason with them. She printed medical forms, explained that Ethan's condition made stairs impossible. Marjorie smiled her tight smile and said, "We're all sympathetic, Mrs. Reeves, but aesthetics matter." You understand, I didn't, not then. When I got home from my next deployment, I saw a new sign posted near the community mailbox. All modifications subject to HOA approval. The ramp had been spray-painted with the words "eyesore" in red. Ethan had seen it before we did. He'd just stared at it, quiet. That night, I caught him scrubbing at the paint with his tiny hands, oxygen tube dragging behind him. I told him to stop. He looked up at me and said, "I just want them to like us, Dad." That one broke me. After that, the letters came monthly, then weekly. Complaints about the ramp, the clutter of medical supplies by our porch, the sound of Ethan's ventilator at night disturbing the peace. The neighbors stopped waving as much. A few crossed the street when I came out in uniform. It wasn't open hostility. It was worse. It was polite cruelty. Sarah tried to keep the warmth alive, decorating the ramp with potted flowers, baking cookies for every HOA meeting. Ethan painted a sign that read, "Welcome, friends," and taped it to his wheelchair. But Marjorie's smile only got thinner. Still, I kept telling myself, these are just rules. Rules can't kill. I didn't know yet how wrong I was. 3 days before it happened, Marjorie sent us a final warning. The board had voted to fine us $250 a day until the ramp was removed. She ended her letter with, "Failure to comply may result in further action, including restriction of access to shared facilities." I remember reading that line twice. Restriction of access. I didn't know she meant the road itself. I was due for a weekend training at the base. I kissed Ethan on the head that morning, told him I'd bring him a Navy patch from the gift shop. He grinned. "Bring me one for Marjorie, too," he said. "Maybe then she'll like us." If I'd known what those words would mean a day later, I'd never have left. They said the word stable like it was supposed to make me feel better. Ethan was alive. But the doctor's face told me what the word really meant. Stable didn't mean safe. It meant still here for now. I stood in that hospital room staring at my son, tubes running across his small chest, monitors blinking like a distant city skyline. Sarah sat beside him, one hand on his arm, whispering the same words over and over. "I'm here, baby. Mommy's here." He didn't answer. I wanted to smash something. Instead, I stared out the window. Below, the hospital parking lot shimmered under the fluorescent lights, clean, organized, accessible. Everything that our neighborhood wasn't. Then I saw Marjorie's car pull in. She walked into the waiting area 10 minutes later, heels clicking like gunfire. Clipboard in hand, of course. She found me near the coffee machine, where I'd been pretending to drink cold coffee just to have something to hold. "Mr. Reeves," she started, "I wanted to check in and—" "Don't," I said. She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Don't speak. Don't explain. Don't even breathe near my family." She pursed her lips, that same practiced calm. "I understand you're upset, but we have procedures." The crew wasn't aware of the medical equipment and— "You had pictures," I said, my voice low. "You've written me about it for months." She straightened, defensive now. The ramp was never approved. The board had no notice of an emergency that day. If you'd filed the proper paperwork— I stepped closer, close enough to see the fear flicker behind her eyes. I buried friends overseas because of people who followed rules instead of saving lives. Don't hide behind your forms. She glanced around the waiting room, suddenly aware of the nurses watching. Her tone softened. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I didn't answer. She left, the smell of lilac trailing behind her like poison. 3 days later, Ethan woke up. His voice was thin, mechanical from the ventilator, but it was his. "Dad?" I froze, then grabbed his hand. "Yeah, buddy." "I'm right here." He blinked slowly. "Did I win?" My throat locked. "Win what?" "The race with the dog." I was almost at the ramp. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say yes. But Sarah answered instead, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You did, baby. You won." He smiled. A faint, sleepy curve. Then he drifted off again. The doctor told us he'd suffered brain hypoxia. Too long without oxygen. He might have trouble walking or speaking clearly again. Maybe worse. That's when something changed in me. I'd spent my life fighting wars for my country. But now the war had followed me home. And it wore a name tag that said, President, Maple Grove HOA. The police called the next day. They'd taken statements from witnesses, neighbors, the EMTS, even the removal crew. Every one of them said the same thing. The HOA had blocked the ambulance. But negligence, the officer told me, isn't always criminal. I felt the words hit like a hammer. She nearly killed my son. "We're not saying there won't be consequences," he said carefully, "but it'll be a civil matter. You'll need to take it up in court. Paperwork, rules, always rules." I hung up and looked at the ramp outside our house, half torn down, jagged boards like broken ribs. I rebuilt it myself that night. Hammer, nails, flashlight between my teeth. Every strike of the hammer felt like a heartbeat. By sunrise, it stood again. Stronger. When the HOA inspector showed up later that morning, clipboard ready, I met him with a camera running. "You record this," I said. "You file one more notice, you trespass again, and I swear I'll turn this whole place inside out." He left without a word. A week later, news trucks showed up. Sarah hadn't wanted to go public. She thought if we stayed quiet, things might calm down. But one of the EMTs, a young woman named Carla, had leaked the story to a local station. Neighborhood HOA blocks ambulance access to disabled child. By noon, it was everywhere. Reporters outside the gate, neighbors whispering behind closed blinds. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, claiming misrepresentation by the media. Marjorie's official statement read, "The board expresses sincere regret for the unfortunate incident but maintains that all actions were within policy guidelines." That phrase, "within policy guidelines," lit a fuse under the entire town. Parents started showing up at meetings. Veterans, too. People with kids in wheelchairs, elderly folks with walkers. They all wanted to know how policy could mean blocking help. Then came the day everything shifted. It was a Thursday evening. Rain. The community hall smelled of wet carpet and cheap coffee. The HOA had scheduled a special hearing, their attempt at damage control. I sat in the back, wearing my uniform. Not to intimidate, to remind them who I was before they tried to erase my family's story. Marjorie opened the meeting with her usual composure. In light of recent events, the board would like to clarify certain misunderstandings. I stood. "You mean lies?" Gasps rippled through the room. She straightened. "Mr. Reeves, this isn't the appropriate—" "My son's been in physical therapy for 3 weeks. He can't hold a pencil anymore. You think that's a misunderstanding?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Marjorie faltered, then turned to the audience. "We sympathize deeply, but as an HOA, we can't assume responsibility for every personal circumstance. You assumed authority over every square inch of this neighborhood," I said. "You fined us for flowers that weren't on your approved list. You tracked how long our trash cans stayed by the curb. But when a kid needed air, suddenly your rules mattered more than his life." Silence. "If that's what community means to you," I said, "then you don't deserve to lead one." I left before anyone could respond. The applause followed me out the door. That night, I found a note taped to my door. It wasn't from Marjorie, it was from an older neighbor, Mr. Donovan, Vietnam vet, quiet guy. "Chief, I saw what they did to your boy. Not all of us agree with her. We're with you." Underneath, a folded newspaper clipping. The story about Ethan. Circled in red ink. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about every family who'd been bullied, shamed, or punished by people hiding behind bureaucracy. 2 weeks later, I hired a lawyer. A good one. We filed a civil suit against the HOA for negligence, emotional distress, and discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The case made local headlines, then state news. Donations poured in from veterans groups and disability rights organizations. Sarah started getting letters from mothers of disabled kids, from other HOAs across the country. Some said, "You gave us courage." Others said, "Thank you for speaking when we couldn't." Ethan began therapy. Progress was slow, but every small movement felt like a miracle. He'd look up at me sometimes and whisper, "We're winning, right, Dad?" And every time I'd say, "Yeah, buddy, we're winning," even if the war wasn't over yet. 3 months later, the court date was set. The neighborhood that once ignored us now lined the sidewalks with handmade signs, "Justice for Ethan." But I wasn't after revenge anymore. I was after accountability and truth. And in that courtroom, I finally found it. The courtroom smelled like paper and nerves. You could feel the tension before the judge even walked in, like the air itself was holding its breath. Sarah sat beside me, fingers laced with mine. Across the aisle sat Marjorie Lang, perfectly composed as ever. Her blazer was cream, her pearls flawless. She looked like someone showing up for a garden brunch, not a negligence trial. Our lawyer, Harris, leaned close. Keep your answers tight. Calm. You don't need to convince the jury. The evidence already does that. Easy for him to say. I wasn't built for calm. The prosecution began with the photos. The cones, the car, the blocked curb, the 911 call logs showing the delay. 7 minutes and 43 seconds before EMTS reached our door. Then came Carla, the EMT. Her hands trembled as she pointed at the exhibit board. We were parked right here. Carla's voice caught. She stood in front of the vehicle waving her arms. Said we couldn't use the private lane without HOA authorization. We lost time. The room went still. You could hear the click of a camera shutter from the press row. Marjorie didn't look at me. She just kept her eyes on her lawyer, lips pressed so tight they almost disappeared. Then it was my turn. I took the stand, the Bible still warm in my hand from the oath. My uniform felt heavier than armor. Chief Reeves, the attorney said, you've served 22 years in the U.S. Navy. You've seen combat. How does this compare? I swallowed. The microphone caught the rasp in my throat. Over there, at least you know who's shooting at you. A murmur ran through the gallery. Tell us what you saw that day. So I did. Every detail. The cones, the panic, Ethan's chair in the grass, the sound Sarah made when she screamed his name. When I reached him, I said, I remember thinking I'd been trained for every kind of chaos except this. Except watching my kid suffocate because someone cared more about property rules than a human life. I looked toward Marjorie. For the first time, her eyes met mine. There was something behind them now, fear, maybe, or recognition. Her defense attorney rose smoothly. Mr. Reeves, emotions aside, would you agree that my client never physically harmed your son? I clenched the rail. She didn't need to. So her actions, while perhaps misguided, were within the scope of her administrative duties. No, I cut in, voice sharper than I meant. Her duty was to protect the people living under her watch. She forgot that part. The judge gave a soft warning. I nodded, breathing hard. The lawyer pressed again. You're a man of discipline, are you not? Trained to follow rules? Yes, I said. Rules that save lives, not endanger them. That landed. Even the judge paused before calling the next witness. Later, Harris presented the HOA's internal emails, obtained through discovery. One message, from Marjorie to her board, read, If we allow one exception, we lose control. The ramp must come down before the next inspection. Another. The Reeves family continues to exploit sympathy. Stand firm. The jurors' faces changed. I didn't feel triumph, just exhaustion. Like every breath cost something I didn't have left. When it was her turn to testify, Marjorie walked to the stand like she was walking into church. Calm. Composed. She swore the oath, then began her practice speech. I've devoted years to maintaining the quality and order of our neighborhood. I regret the incident, but I was following the regulations as written. I never intended harm. Her lawyer nodded encouragingly. Then Harris asked, Did you receive medical documentation from the Reeves family about their son's condition? She hesitated. Yes. And did you still instruct maintenance to remove the accessibility ramp? Pause. Yes, but only after due process. Was that process more important than the child's safety? Her voice faltered. It's not about importance, it's about fairness. Fairness, Harris repeated softly. To whom? No answer. I watched her eyes flick toward me again, and this time she looked smaller. The clipboard armor had cracked. The closing arguments blurred together. Words like duty, compassion, responsibility echoed off the walls. When the jury left to deliberate, the silence was unbearable. I found myself gripping Sarah's hand so tight she whispered, "Breathe, Dan." Just breathe, I did. For the first time in months, I did. 45 minutes later, the jury returned. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Maple Grove Homeowners Association, guilty of negligence resulting in harm. My knees almost gave out. We further award damages to the plaintiffs in the amount of... I didn't hear the number. Sarah was crying into my shoulder, whispering Ethan's name. Across the aisle, Marjorie sat frozen. Not angry, not crying, just staring, as if realizing the walls she'd built out of rules couldn't keep out the truth anymore. Outside, cameras flashed, microphones shouted questions. I said nothing. The only thing I wanted was to go home, to the ramp, the tree, the wind chime. That night, I sat by Ethan's bed. He was asleep, breathing through his machine, soft and steady. I brushed his hair back and whispered, "We did it, buddy. You can rest." He stirred slightly, murmuring, "Good job, Dad." That's when the tears came, not the hot, angry ones, but the quiet kind that burned from relief. For the first time, I wasn't a soldier fighting enemies. I was a father who'd finally kept his promise. But even as the verdict echoed in my mind, I knew the real fight wasn't over. Not for us, not for families like ours. And that realization would become the start of something bigger. The news vans were gone by morning. All that was left were the wheel ruts in the grass and a mailbox stuffed with letters. Some were from strangers who'd seen the trial on TV. Others came from people who'd lived the same kind of quiet cruelty in their own neighborhoods. Every envelope felt like a hand on my shoulder. Ethan's verdict fund, what people started calling it online, grew faster than we could process. Sarah set most of it aside for medical therapy programs. She said it didn't belong to us alone. She was right. I thought winning the case would make everything go silent again, that justice would feel like peace. It didn't. It felt like standing in the eye of a storm, hearing the echoes of everything that had already blown away. 2 weeks after the trial, I ran into Marjorie in the grocery store. No reporters, no lawyers, just fluorescent lights and the hum of refrigerators. She looked smaller somehow, shoulders slumped, shopping cart half empty. I expected anger to come roaring back, but it didn't. She caught my eye and froze. "Mr. Reeves," she said quietly. "Ma'am." There was a long pause, the kind that stretches a heartbeat into an hour. She started to speak, stopped, then whispered, "I'm sorry." Not the polished version from her statements. A real one. Raw, trembling. I nodded once. "I know." Then I turned away. Forgiveness wasn't a ceremony. It was just choosing not to carry the fire anymore. At home, Ethan was making progress. His speech therapist had taped drawings all over the living room wall. Crayon rockets, stick figure soldiers, a blue wheelchair with wings. He'd call it his flight chair. Every day, he practiced pushing one wheel, then the other. Every inch forward was a victory lap. Sometimes he'd look at me and say, "Dad, they fixed the ramp." And I'd answer, "Yeah, buddy." We fixed more than that. The neighborhood changed too. The HOA board resigned one by one. A new committee formed. Parents, veterans, retirees, people who understood what community was supposed to mean. They rewrote the bylaws. The first new rule was simple. No policy shall endanger a neighbor's safety or dignity. Someone framed it and hung it at the entrance gate. Sarah called it Ethan's Law. Months passed. The reporters stopped calling. Life settled into something gentler. On quiet mornings, I'd sit on the porch with coffee, listening to the wind chime on the maple tree. It played the same soft, uneven melody Ethan had loved before everything changed. Sometimes I'd still see flashes of that day, the cones, the flashing lights, but they didn't choke me anymore. They reminded me why we'd fought. Then, one Saturday, a small white envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mr. Reeves, our neighborhood voted last night to install ramps for 2 new families with disabled kids. The motion passed unanimously. We wanted you to know your fight made a difference. A neighbor from across town, I read it twice, then pinned it above my workbench. Not as a trophy, just a reminder that pain can plant something that grows past it. Ethan turned 11 that summer. We threw a backyard party, balloons tied to the ramp rails, barbecue smoke curling through the trees. The same neighbors who once crossed the street came carrying gifts and awkward smiles. Forgiveness works quietly like that. It invites people back without words. As the sun went down, Ethan wheeled up beside me, holding the same wind chime he'd made with Sarah. The shells clinked softly. "Let's hang it again," he said. We did, right where it had always belonged. The breeze caught it, and for a second it sounded like laughter. That night, after everyone left, I stood alone on the porch. The yard lights flickered across the repaired ramp, clean and strong. I thought about the journey, from silence to sirens, from anger to calm, and realized I wasn't the same man who'd come home that night months ago. Back then, I believed strength meant control. Now I knew it meant compassion strong enough to outlast fury. I looked at the ramp, the wind chime, the stars beyond the trees, and whispered, "We're home, son. Really home." It's been 2 years since that day. People still ask me what justice felt like. I tell them justice isn't a verdict or a law. It's what you do after the noise fades. It's the quiet choice you make when no one's watching. For me, it started the morning I drove Ethan to his new therapy center. The building had wide doors, long ramps, sunlight in every hallway. Above the entrance, a brass plaque read, "Built for All." I stopped for a second, staring at those words, and felt something shift. For the first time, the ache didn't sting. It hummed, steady, like a scar that had learned how to heal. A few months later, I began speaking at community safety panels across the state. Not as a soldier, not as a father demanding revenge, just as a man who'd seen what silence costs. I'd start every talk the same way. The rules we write don't protect us unless they protect everyone. At first, my voice would shake. I wasn't used to talking about feelings, about vulnerability, about failure. But every time I looked into the crowd, I'd see someone's eyes glisten, a parent, a teacher, a neighbor, and I'd realize this wasn't my story anymore. It was ours. Sarah started volunteering with a foundation that builds accessible playgrounds. She called it Recess for All. Ethan became their youngest ambassador. He'd roll up in his blue flight chair, showing other kids how ramps could mean freedom, not pity. One day, he told me, "Dad, I don't remember the bad parts anymore. I just remember you coming home that line. It undid me. Because that's what every parent wants, isn't it? Not revenge. Just to know your child's world is still full of light." The HOA that once turned us away became a symbol of reform. Ethan's Law spread county by county, then state by state. It was simple, really. Just common sense written into policy. But that's how most change begins. Small, stubborn, and unstoppable. I never saw Marjorie again after that day in the store. but sometimes when I pass the old entrance gate, I see fresh flowers by the sign. No name, no card, just lilies. Maybe from her, maybe not. I don't need to know. Forgiveness doesn't keep score. The other night I found Ethan asleep with his drawing pad open. On the page was a crayon picture, a ramp that stretched into the clouds, a tiny wheelchair with wings, and two stick figures holding hands. He'd written at the bottom in uneven letters, "We rise." I stood there in the doorway, realizing that all my years in uniform, every mission, every medal, had never taught me what that picture did. Strength isn't the ability to fight. It's the courage to stay soft when the world hardens around you. Sometimes I still wake up before dawn and sit outside with coffee. The neighborhood's quiet now, peaceful. The ramp catches the moonlight like a silver ribbon. The wind chime hums that same uneven melody. It's the sound of a promise kept. I think back to that first night, the chaos, the shouting, the heartbreak, and realize something I never could have seen back then. That tragedy didn't end us. It rewrote us. Every scar in that story turned into a blueprint for change. And if you're hearing this now, if you've ever felt powerless against people hiding behind rules or titles, remember, you don't need to fight with fists. You fight by standing, by speaking, by refusing to let cruelty be the final word. Because justice isn't loud, it's steady. And sometimes it sounds like a child's laughter echoing down a ramp at sunset. Comment below what justice means to you,